All right, so tonight we're welcoming Jocelyn Goldfein, who was heading up mobile development at Facebook. The way that I met Jocelyn, I had my company at some point, and I was introduced to Jocelyn by one of my advisors, and I was just so impressed with her. I was like, I got to get to know that woman. One thing led to another. We worked together at Facebook, and now that she left and she has a little bit more time, I'm super excited that now she's sharing her wisdom on how to build great software companies.
All right. Thank you so much, Sophie Charlotte. This is too large a crew for me to ask us to go around the room introducing ourselves, which I would sometimes inflict on smaller talks, audiences. But maybe we can just do a little bit of self-introduction by show of hand. Everybody here makes products. You're a software engineer, you're a designer, you're a product manager. That rounds to everybody. Great. How many of you work for very small companies, 20 people or fewer, like little startups? Okay. And then you're at a company with some traction. Maybe you're entering but still a small company, maybe 200 employees or fewer. How many of you is that? All right. You're in the medium-sized zone. You're in kind of that tweener category of a couple hundred employees to a couple thousand employees. You're at a big company. You're at Microsoft or Google or thousands and thousands. Okay. So we have mostly the small audience here. That's great. And thank you, because that's very helpful. It helps me tailor what I'm saying to hopefully land on the points that are most relevant and significant to you. A little bit of background about myself, just to reciprocate. As Sophie Charlotte mentioned, I most recently was running mobile engineering at Facebook. Before Facebook, I worked at VMware. You could not imagine two companies that are more diametrically opposite in what they do. And I learned a lot from actually the differences between the two companies, and that's a lot of what this talk is about. Before Facebook even, I had two other experiences that were helpful and that were different from Facebook and VMware. One of which was working at a custom enterprise software company that sold very large, very customized deals, like $50 million software license deals called Trilogy in Austin, Texas. And I had my own startup. I co-founded a startup with two friends, and we built web-based software for enterprises. So all of this will actually be relevant to the talk. I promise I'm not just blathering my bio at you for grunts. So, you would think that having made software in such vastly different environments at companies as small as 4 people and as large as, I guess, 10,000, or across consumer to enterprise, or somewhere on the span from operating systems to consumer web and mobile, like that I would be able to put together a grand unified theory of how to make software. And I would love to say that I have that theory and I'm here to share it with you today. But I don't. There is no such thing. And I feel confident that I've been enough places to declare with firm certainty that there is no such thing as a grand unified theory of how to make software. There are some truisms that seem to hold across a lot of environments, like the value of integrating often, and the earlier you fix a bug, the better it is. And I've never found software that didn't benefit from beta testing. But, there is really, there are not a lot of principles that hold up in every single environment and every set of circumstances. And the reason for that probably won't surprise you, which is everything we do, all the techniques and tips and best practices and methodologies that we put together to make and ship software that delights our users, it's all trade-offs. Have you ever been or had to work with that annoying engineer who says, features, resources, date, pick 2? Anybody? Show of hands, will you cop to it? I've been that engineer. I've worked with that engineer. There's various variations on this theme too, right? Like sometimes it's, quality, features, quality schedule, or schedule's always on there because it's the one engineers hate the most. It's the one I hate the most. Well, I think there's more than 3. I think, this is sort of the 9 that I think feature most often, but there's, maybe this is 8. But there's many, and you could write your own version of this list that is relevant to your own product. But the reality is, when we think about software release process and software delivery, different kinds of process optimize for different things in this trade-off space. And you might say, wait, hey, I want all of those things. I want high quality software with beautiful UX that ships frequently and ships on time and, and has really compelling and differentiated features. Like nobody could look at this list and say, item number 3, performance. I don't need that. Okay? But because every single one of these things costs engineering time, and there's no such thing as a free lunch, no matter what you do, no matter how you spend your time, you are going to end up trading off one or another of these things. And if you decide I'm going to do all of them, then that's just a decision to peanut butter your resources across all of them. That's not deciding to have it all. That's deciding not to make any trade-offs. And so I think that if there is one way to approach software delivery, it's not to say, okay, I'm going to figure out how the best people do it and copy them. It's to figure out what are the priorities that matter to you and pick the practices that optimize for that. Well, how do you do that? The Guggenheim Museum is widely considered one of the most, the best real-world examples of the architectural principle that form follows function. And what that means is the design of the building is not based on pure aesthetics or the mind of the architect. It's based on the use for which the building is to be put. And likewise, your software release process, your priorities, which of those things you pick, what point in the trade-off space, in the n-dimensional trade-off space you choose to position yourself at, that's not a question of taste or aesthetics or religion. You might think it is. But it's not about your personality, whether you like to go fast or like to go slow. It's actually just fundamentally shaped by your function. What are the constraints? And to sort of make that even more crisp, I've trotted out like this really boring tool we get from McKinsey, the McKinsey Foursquare, which is a very oversimplified way of thinking about trade-offs. All right. And so if we think about trade-offs, we can plot them on this plane that says, well, let me look at costs versus benefits. So some things cost me very little and they're very important. So yay, I'm going to do a lot of those. And some things are very expensive, but luckily they're not important to me. So yay, I get to sacrifice those and reclaim those resources and put them on something else. Then I have these troubling choices about things that are, easy but maybe not very valuable and things that are hard but important. And I probably have to do some from each of that bucket. So if we take this notion of trade-offs and try to apply it to our world of, all the things we want to optimize for when we're shipping software, what it comes down to is when you try to think about, well, what's important to me, you can actually now start to think about, well, what drives my business and what drives my costs. And I think that comes down largely to two factors. Your costs are driven by a lot of things, okay? Like what geography you're in and how talented your engineers are and many other things. But all else being equal across different kinds of software companies, your technology stack is a big driver of how hard or how easy it is to do something. It is to build features or how hard or easy it is to ship frequently. And if you think about the technology stack you use as a spectrum with high level, with things running on your own servers that you control, the web at sort of the ultimate right-hand side of the spectrum, and going lower and lower in the stack to native software and desktop apps and operating systems, as you go lower in the stack, and crucially, as your deployment environment gets further and further out of your control, because you are running on somebody else's hardware that they control, you'll find that different things get easier and harder. When you control the hardware you're deploying on, it is easier to deploy. And it is also easier to test, because you don't have to think about a test matrix. You don't have to think about all the possible devices or operating system combinations in the world to run on. You only have to run on the hardware operating system combo that you run on. You only have to think about AWS or whatever it may be. At the same time, you also get more reuse the further up the stack you live, because you get to reuse libraries and toolkits that other people have written and live above them on the chain. So why does anybody write anything but web apps? Why do we go down the stack? Well, some things are easier as you go down the stack. You generally get more, you're generally able to write highly reliable software more easily lower on the stack. You're generally able to get more performance. You're generally able to have more control. So depending on what kinds of features you're building, you may need to go lower in the stack in order to build it. A really good example is if you think about video game technology, classically are the ones that go write their own graphics drivers and don't just write apps that sit on top of the operating system. And so for features in UX, depending on what you're trying to build, you're going to live somewhere in the technology stack. But what I would say is most of the time, people don't pick their technology stack based on what's going to make for an easy or a difficult software release process. Most of the time, people pick the technology farthest to the right, that is where it's physically possible to build their features, right? Because the further you live on the right, the more reuse you get, the less you have to build on your own. And you move grudgingly to the left, as required to build functionality when you don't have the capability to do it. For example, for the last 5 years, product companies were very happily building web apps, and we have all grudgingly been forced to move to native mobile apps because we could not get the performance and the richness of UX that a native app delivers by doing web on mobile. And if we could, we would go back to web, I would assert. All right, so let's talk about how important is it to me? And I will argue again that this is driven by your business model, and that there are a lot of ways that your company can make money. Your company can even be a nonprofit and not make money. But in that case, you have some other measure of impact on the world you're trying to have. And I would say that again, you can look at this like a spectrum, and that sort of at one end of the world, there are, companies like the one I used to work for, Trilogy, that is selling software for buckets of dollars, usually to big companies, because those are the ones who have buckets of dollars. You can sell software to enterprises for less money. VMware is actually pretty cheap in the grand scheme of things that enterprises can buy. The fact that you can spend $2,000 is cheap in the scheme of enterprise software. And as you sort of approach the origin and smaller dollars, now you're talking about selling to small and medium businesses. Maybe you're charging money to consumers. This is not a very common thing anymore, but we still fork out money for a few people still fork out money for Microsoft Office. That's not so common. But maybe you're building a freemium mobile app and I spend $10 or $15 a year on Candy Crush. Or maybe your software is absolutely free and ad supported. All right. And so again, on this spectrum, different things matter to your user base depending on how you're making your money. So interestingly, even though you charge less per entity, the further right you go, the higher UX expectations are. When people are using your software because they want to, because they find joy in it, not because it solves a business problem for them, then it really is all about the user experience. And so the cheaper your product is, actually the more fun it has to be to use. When your software solves a really difficult business problem, or when the company is committed to a payroll processing system, I would love it if the expense reporting system that I use at work was a joy to use. But honestly, the reason it isn't is because it doesn't have to be, because work gives it to me and I use it because I don't have anything else. On the other hand, when companies have forked over lots of money for your software and their business now depends on your software, they have very high expectations of reliability and predictability. They expect that when you say a feature is going to be there, it is there. They expect that your service does not go down. They expect that it is not buggy. And as much as we mock Twitter for the fail whale, the rampant existence of the fail whale in no way slowed down Twitter's momentum. So when people's life does not depend on your software, when their ability to make money does not depend on your software, maybe you can get away with reliability not being perfect. It will eventually kill you to be unreliable, but there's a spectrum of how reliable you need to be. I want to acknowledge that other business models exist than charging enterprises licensing for software or giving stuff away free for ads. Maybe your software is actually a platform that developers use in an ecosystem. Maybe it's actually an e-commerce play and you're Uber or Airbnb and you actually sell the service and your software just powers it. All of those, I think, can be kind of mapped onto this spectrum. I think they resemble points on this spectrum. And I think that you're going to be able to extrapolate from what I say about consumer and enterprise to apply to those business models. I also want to acknowledge that technology, this talk is full of caveats, technology and your business model are not the only drivers of costs and benefits in your world. Lots of other things exist. For example, is your company care more about growth or care more about profit? Does acquiring new customers matter more to you versus the happiness and satisfaction of your existing customers? What is the caliber of your existing engineering team? Can you get more for less because you're punching above your fighting weight? There's lots of things. But technology and business model are the only ones I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to leave the rest as an exercise for the reader. The good news is a lot of you in really small companies, so, the answer is definitely growth, not profit, definitely new customers, not existing. And so, that means that, that's a helpfully simplifying assumption. All right, so now that we've established that we're talking about two different axes, we can do the thing that we like to do with axes, which is put them on a two-dimensional plane. So here we are with technology across the x-axis and business model on the y-axis. And I have placed the companies I've worked for on this axis. So here's Facebook, which is sort of the ultimate web and free ad-supported up in the top right. And it, of course, has to move to mobile. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. My startup was called Message One. Trilogy down here, charged a lot of money. VMware way in the bottom left. And actually, as I was driving up here, I remembered that my summer internships in college were with Netscape, We're comfortably ensconced in the center of the upper left. So I have truly lived in every single zone on this plane, which was not maybe very good planning on my part. But there it is. And I'll throw a few more examples up here just in case, my own personal ones, just to sort of help you picture what these different zones are like. So Office we can think of as a desktop app that charges money. Like even within, these zones are large, and like Office and, Facebook Mobile I put in the same zone 1 up here, and they're obviously quite different. Salesforce being the quintessential enterprise web story. So before I proceed, I just want to make sure I've got all of you following me and also give myself a little more demographic information about you. And I want to do the show of hands thing again to see where all of you live on this plane. So here in the upper left, so native apps, operating systems, desktop apps, mobile apps, used by consumers for free or for little or for small amounts of money. How many of you are in zone 1? Okay, great. All right, coming across. So you are web and still consumer, still free or a little money on upper right. Maybe not even web, but your service runs server side. Maybe you're a platform that has no UI. If you're all server side, you can be in the right-hand side of the zone. All right. And now coming negative on the y-axis, we're still in web land, but now you're selling a service to enterprise, to businesses for larger amounts of money. All right. Excellent. And bottom left, you sell software to businesses who run it on their own hardware. Anybody? Zone 4 is dead. Well, good. It's the hardest zone. You're going to pat yourself on the back in a few seconds. Okay. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about how being in each of these zones kind of shapes the DNA of your company. And I'm going to make broad characterizations. Remember, Microsoft Office and Facebook for iOS live in the same zone. So that's how broad these characterizations are. And you're going to want to do this exercise for your own product and your own business. But let's talk about one trait that is shaped by this DNA. Not by religion, not by personality, not by tablets from a mountaintop. Let's talk about your appetite for risk. And we love in Silicon Valley to talk about risk and to advocate for risk and how important it is for entrepreneurs to take risks. And the biggest risk is not taking a risk. But let's seriously talk about, right? It's cliche riddled. And I myself guilty. The very first post in my short series of blog posts is the importance of taking risk. So I'm right there with that crew. But let's really talk about what it means to be risk-seeking, because I don't think this is just a personality quality of like, am I, thrill-seeking or am I risk-averse? I think for all of us, we all think we have, the right appetite for risk, and people taking more risks than us are sort of lunatics, and people taking less risks than us are conservatives who are going to be disrupted. But let's try to see if we can be analytical about it. So how you should think about risk is really at what point does the cost of a mistake swamp the benefit of what you're trying to do? And so let's think about the cost of a mistake. Well, there's your literal cost to fix. You ship a bug in your software. You ship something unintentional that breaks the service you're attempting to offer. What is the cost of that to you, to your company, to your product, to your business? Well, first and foremost, there's your cost to fix it. There's the amount of engineering time to track down what went wrong, to come up with new code, to test it, to make sure it's right this time, and then to deploy it out there to all your users so that the software that's running in production is correct. And that cost, I will say, is that's some baseline cost that exists no matter what your software is. But it's a heck of a lot less if the place you need to deploy the fix to is your own servers that you control, your own AWS instances. And it becomes more costly when you need to get it out to some device controlled by the user or with some third party standing in your way, like maybe an App Store approval process. But trust me, even an App Store approval process is a way easier update scenario than, VMware, where if we had a problem with the operating systems that we had shipped to customers' data centers, we had to ship them a new gold CD, which they would test for 3 months before they would install it onto the machines running in their data center. All right. So if you move left, if you move from hardware you control to hardware other people control, as you move left, the cost of fixing your mistake goes way up. Likewise, there is another and even more important cost when you make a mistake, and that is how badly does it hurt your user? How badly does it hurt the community of people depending on your software and your service? How badly does it hurt your brand and your retention and your engagement? How much does it make your product suck for the people that it's for? And that comes down to, well, how much were they counting on it? So the length of time of the outage matters, right? If you get the Twitter fail whale, but you reload the page and it's up again, it's no big deal. So again, controlling your software makes your deployment environment and being able to fix things faster helps. But it also matters what they were counting on your software for. If they were counting on you for entertainment and you're not there for an hour or two, if they were counting on you for receiving messages and they eventually come through, then that cost to your users is not so great. They may not give up and go away. But if the cost to your users of your outage is they can't book revenue because you're their bookings engine, or they can't do their jobs, or they can't, launch the rocket, then all of a sudden you're mission critical and your outage has caused devastating pain to your users, which may be so bad that they stop wanting to work with you, or certainly vastly reduces their loyalty, and it gives them a big incentive to reduce their dependency on you, all of which are really bad for your business. So if you think about there is some natural amount of appetite for risk that's appropriate, and if it lives, if that minimum baseline, and that amount is X, whatever it is, I want to say that 1X is the amount of risk, is the cost of a mistake in the upper right here, where it's not business critical, nobody's paid you a fortune for it, and you can deploy the fix as quickly as you come up with it. And you become an order of magnitude, and the mistake becomes an order of magnitude more costly when it gets hard to deploy the fix. And it becomes an order of magnitude more costly when the people affected by it have paid you a lot of money and are depending on your software to be up. And unfortunately, well, now you can all pat yourselves on the back. None of you live in this zone where 2 orders of magnitude have a compound effect and make it really expensive and bad to make a mistake. And so when you think about software release process and testing and checklists and soak time and freeze times, a whole lot of the processes that we build into thinking about the right way to make software are fundamentally about management of risk and how much time and energy you are willing to pay to avoid the chance of shipping a bug or making a mistake. And so what this graph tells you is there is not one right amount. If someone from Facebook comes and says to you, move fast and break things, you idiots, get it out there, you would be well advised to listen to them if you're working on Candy Crush, but you probably will get yourself in some trouble if you're working on, let's pick a pertinent example, Oculus. So it's quite important to think about where advice is coming from. I'm going to step a little quickly through each of the zones just to kind of make this germane to each of your fields. A bunch of you were in zone 1. And so I'm going to point out a few features. So what I've tried to do is make that Foursquare for each zone, broadly speaking. And I would encourage you not to take this as gospel. Just because you raised your hand on zone 1 doesn't mean this is the right Foursquare for you. You may want to change things up. But really meditate, really think about what you need to optimize for. And I'll point out 2 interesting features of this slide. One is, I put features in the costs less bucket and more important bucket. I think features are always important. By definition, they're what your product does. So they're always, so this is the one thing that's never going to move. It's always going to be in the top right, no matter what zone you're in. And I assume that it belongs on the cost less side, even though features are always expensive, because I'm going to assume you picked the technology stack based on where was the easiest to build your features. That's why you're in that technology stack. And so, it's sort of definitionally what you're anchored on. And then everything else, you just have to work with or against the advantages and disadvantages of your technology stack. The other thing I'm going to say is there is no technology stack that makes scheduled predictability cheap. Scheduled predictability, and I don't mean which I mean hitting the deadline, all right? Which some companies love and some hate and some don't care about at all, is always expensive. I don't care what your technology stack is. I don't care what process you use. I have never found a world in which predictability is really, really cheap. And the things you can do to make it cheap have to do with doing the same thing over and over and over again. So it's for really late. You guys are all in the growth phase. So trust me, predictability is never cheap when you're in the growth phase. All right. So that's always going to show up on the expensive side. And I think what's useful about making this Foursquare is a few things. One is it really shows you what you need to prioritize and pay attention to and not neglect. And the other is if you find anything in this bottom left corner, you can kill it with fire. That is the one thing you can afford to sacrifice. You never have. I've never met a startup that had enough resources to go around, that had enough engineering, design, PM, bandwidth to do everything we aspire to do. And so when you find something that you can X off the list, do it. That's pure waste. That's straight efficiency to your bottom line. And I think that a mistake that classically small companies make, especially if they're in the consumer world, is to think scheduled predictability matters. And to spend way too much time and energy and effort on it when it doesn't. So what else would I say? So schedule predictability here. So remember your more important, less important axis is largely driven by the business model. So predictability doesn't matter to consumers. If you show up with new features, they'll be joyful, but that's, like barring the sort of boxed goods, I must hit the Christmas season with my new feature, with my video game. So that's, I guess, video games would be a good example of something where schedule predictability does count once a year. But apart from that, it is generally not that important. Whether you ship on February 1st or February 10th or even in March. But it is quite important that you have a really rich UX, that you have great performance. And it's probably helpful to run on all the platforms of the consumers you want to sell to. And it's probably quite helpful to update frequently so that you are constantly bringing new features to market that will help add more users, because user growth is going to be driven, in the consumer world, is going to be driven by engagement and distribution and reach. When we move to zone 2, and now we're on the web, some other things, deployment gets really easy, like update frequency is still important to us, but now it moves to the right. It went from expensive to cheaper because we're on the web. UX and performance get a little harder on the web, still important. Reliability now maybe not so important because you can fix things whenever you want to. And so maybe you can afford to take more risks when you're on the web. You can afford to allow more bugs, to have a release process that allows a few more bugs to escape because you're going to know you're going to be able to stamp them out very quickly. As you cross to the enterprise, now you do have to kind of care about schedule predictability. If you promise people features that kind of need to be there when you said they would, because that tends to gate your revenue. It may still be helpful to have frequent updates because it lets you fix bugs, but actually your customers don't really want your software changing all the time. So that may be less importance to you. Lots of people would take issue with me saying UX is ever not important, and it is always important. All of these things are always important, but it might be a place where you can afford to go slower or make some sacrifices in order to ensure other things that your customers care more about. And of course, you may be the enterprise web software that is differentiating on great UX, and it is important to you. Feel free to make your own. But I encourage you to put something in the bottom left because some things are because you can't prioritize everything. And nobody lives in zone 4, so I'm not going to dwell on this slide. But it's it is precisely the rotation of the other 3. So if you think about, in general, like you could start kind of grossly stereotyping companies in these different zones with different kind of slogans, right? And if there's a slogan for hey, I can take a lot of risks, but I'm going to be really aggressive, it would be the Facebook move fast and break things in the top right. I think in the top left, which is a world where you're building richer software with more constraints, but you're going to more effort to deliver something more wonderful, it is still all about delighting the user. And I think user delight is still quite an important reason for your choice of technology stack on the left. But as you go down, it's really more about not so much delight, but reliability. The delight comes from the reliability, the fact that as a user, I know I can count on my operating system. I know that my data center can operate on this infrastructure. And when I'm a business who's thinking about using software as a service, like, the ultimate sort of Salesforce, the end of soft pitch, right? The end of software, like this is just hassle-free. You don't have to install it. You don't have to deal with it. You don't have to deploy it. It just works. And so I think there are actually I guess the point of this slide is to say, no one of these zones is the right place to be. If you come to me and say, Jocelyn, which zone should I be in? Like you said, the cost of a mistake is the least in the top right. Does that mean, I should really only start a company there? I would say, no, they're wonderful companies in every zone. There's a wonderful way to be a kind of the company that you are. It's just useful to be that and to know it. And I think that's important because, as engineers, we love to get in holy wars, right? Like, we can argue about how many characters of line width there should be, and, VI versus Emacs is infamous, let alone other religious battles that we have. And we do tend to get really aggressively certain that the way we ship software, how much we test, how long we wait, when we freeze, how people collaborate, do we do code reviews, we feel a strong... we're not just pragmatists about that stuff. We're not just like, oh yes, I've selected the best tool to use on this occasion. Like, we get religion. We get holy. We think we've discovered natural law, that this is the one right way to do it. And forever after, I'm going to do it this way. And any environment I go into, I'm going to do it this way. And by the way, when I meet someone who's doing it a different way, they're a total moron. And I don't want to work with them. And they need to really rethink things. And I think that's quite dangerous. And if there is like one, I think it would be great if you all go home and pencil out Foursquares and realize that there's changes you can make to your process because you've recognized that maybe you're spending effort on something that doesn't matter, or maybe you should spend more effort on something that does. But honestly, if none of you do any of that, if all you take away from this is like a healthy skepticism about the universality, about the universal goodness or badness of any given software process, then I will feel thrilled to death with the impact of the talk, because I think that skepticism is warranted. I think we get overly attached, and that attachment really actually hurts us, because it turns out that if your company is successful, chances are very good you're not going to have just one product, and you're not going to stay contained in one zone. You're going to be Facebook, and you're going to go from having a consumer web product to also needing a consumer mobile product. Or maybe you're going to realize that different products have different constituencies. So, I drew Facebook as living solely in, consumer free land, but the reality is that the tools Facebook builds for advertisers actually live under constraints that a lot more resemble enterprise software. Or have any of you been a Facebook developer? Like developed on the Facebook platforms? All right, if you were people who develop on top of Facebook's API, it's a pretty miserable experience. It sucks. And the NPS scores from Facebook's developer ecosystem on our platform, are low. All right? And part of that is because the trade-offs that are ideal, the DNA that makes for building great end user consumer software, isn't exactly what you want. So if you're successful, you're going to end up spanning different zones, and you're actually going to need to be able to adopt different kinds of practices for different products. And by the way, if you are unsuccessful, then one thing you are likely to do is pivot. You are likely to say, oh, my web app is not getting traction, it needs to be mobile. Or, oh, my productivity app isn't finding a market with consumers, maybe I can sell it to small businesses. And so in order to pivot, you are going to find that you need to adopt not just different practices, but different values. And so I guess the less attached you are to those values, or the more you want to be attached to your values, you want to be the best you can at what you are, but the more you understand where they come from, so that you're prepared to change when conditions change, the better off you're going to be. And I think this was particularly challenging for Facebook. And I think actually this is the heart of what was challenging for Facebook about transitioning to mobile. And, that's a little bit of a misnomer, because Facebook's had at least 2 or 3 successive transitions to mobile, and every one of them has been hard for different reasons. But I think at its core, from the outside, it's sort of hard to fathom how it could possibly be so difficult and take so long. I mean, how many people in this room know PHP? All right, it's a pretty easy language. All right, if you know C, you could know PHP in 30 minutes. All right, and how many of you know Objective-C? All right, like iOS. Okay, so these are 2 different programming languages, but the differences, and the 2 different sets of libraries and frameworks, but the differences are minute, okay? Facebook caliber engineers can transition from PHP to Objective-C, the language and framework, that pivot, takes a few weeks, maybe some months for the people making big architecture decisions. The change in technology was not the problem. That was not what was hard. The change in culture was what was hard. So, at Facebook, we had a set of product teams. There was no web team at Facebook. There were product teams. There was a newsfeed team who built newsfeed. There was a photos team who built photos. There was a messenger team who built messenger. All those teams built those things for the web. When mobile started, it was small, and there was a small mobile team that built every feature for iOS. And I won't tell you what we did on Android because it's too embarrassing. But it was bad. And then we said, hey, we've really got to adopt mobile. We've got all these teams who are building for web. The fastest way for Facebook to deliver experiences on mobile is just to is to just build some, technical magic and use HTML5 and just make really great HTML5 apps, so that all these product teams that are used to building for the web can just keep building for the web, and it will just magically work on phones. And, we wholeheartedly tried that for a year or 2, but the problem was it was based on what was convenient for us. We actually made a technology stack decision based on cost rather than based on features and users. That was a mistake, widely documented elsewhere. And we came to the conclusion that we had to switch to native, that we had to build native apps, because that was the way that we were going to deliver the UX, the performance, and the functionality that users needed. And so we chose the right technology stack finally for the users of the software. And when we did that, we still had this centralized mobile team. We didn't have enough people who knew the technology, and we thought we could hire a bunch really quickly and move a bunch into that centralized team. And so that team got larger and larger, and it was like a real sprint, and we locked them in a conference room with a lot of Red Bull for, as compressed a period of time as we could, and we ran, and we shipped a new iOS app in a short amount of time, and a new Android app that we could finally be proud of. And those apps were pretty good. They weren't bad. They were a massive improvement over what we had before. But we still had these centralized teams, and most of the engineers in the company for the product teams were just building for the web. And this was quickly becoming untenable, because if you're the newsfeed team and you are excited about achieving newsfeed's goals, you are not excited about depending on some other team to deliver the mobile newsfeed experience. Facebook announced its earnings today, and I noticed with interest the big headline is 70% of Facebook's revenue is coming from mobile right now. So even a year or two ago, it was very evident that usage was shifting strongly towards mobile. And so it's not acceptable if you're the photos team to not control the photos experience. But the problem was that we had really a vast difference in beliefs about how to make software between these product teams who had the DNA of zone 2 of the web, move fast and break things. And the way a product team at Facebook would design a new feature or a new product is they would envision something, they'd build a prototype, they'd turn it on for 1 or 2% of users, they'd see how it performed, they'd A/B test it a little bit, they'd make some changes based on the feedback, they'd see how that went. If it was good, they'd keep tweaking it, but usually it was bad, and so they went back to the drawing board and they invented something else and they tried that. And they'd go through 8 or 9 of these cycles that were each sort of a week or two long, before they'd land on something really good, and then they would build it out and productize it and ship it to everybody. Minus a holdout so they could do good analytics. And so that was just the nature of how good product was done. Meanwhile, the mobile team was largely newcomers, largely came from this world, here in Zone 1, and felt very strongly that the proper way to ship software involved UI freeze 4 weeks out, and long testing cycles, and long soak times, and not making changes right before you were going to ship, and sort of a very rigid process of who could make changes when to the branch. And, and absolute, hey, if you missed the train, too bad, like come back in 4 weeks. And so what was very difficult for a product team was if you want to ship on that every 4-week schedule, but it was really an 8-week-long schedule where you'd code for 4 weeks, and then you'd test and fix bugs for 4 weeks, and then ship. And the way they shipped every 4 weeks was to have 2 of those cycles overlapping at any given time. So what would happen is, if you had a new design and you wanted to run an experiment, you would get it into the next mobile release, and it would go out on day 1. And then on day 5, you'd learn something, and you'd make some tweaks, and that would take you a day or 2. But by the time you want to make those changes, you're already past freeze for the next release. So your opportunity to change the feature and get it in front of users again is actually at T plus 8 weeks from when your first experiment ran. So your 2-week cycle becomes an 8 or 16-week cycle. And so, and product teams viewed this with horror and said, no, mobile guys, you're doing it all wrong. Whereas the mobile guys sort of saw this approach of, we're incapable of designing software without putting it in front of users as, no, guys, you're doing it all wrong. And the result of this was, what I called it in the previous slide. It was a culture war. Instead of saying, hey, we like our process because it has these properties and it optimizes for these things, and we like our process because it has these properties and optimizes for these things, what we had instead was 2 groups of people who really kind of felt that the other group was, at best guilty of bad taste, and at worst, a serious threat to the integrity and identity of the company. And so it was very, very hard for these 2 groups to cooperate. And it was very, very hard for the mobile team to want to sort of give up the reins and let the product teams take ownership of their features. And yet, that's what transition to mobile means. If Facebook has one mobile team, it's not a mobile company. Facebook's a mobile company when the newsfeed team is building newsfeed on mobile, when the photos team is building photos on mobile, right? That's what mobile first means. You're not an afterthought done by a side team. You are the main platform everybody works on. And so it was a rocky transition. It meant, first of all, building relationships and building trust. It meant helping the folks who'd only ever shipped on web to see that there are differences on the native platform, that our ability to deploy on that hardware is just distinct than on hardware we control, and that means they have to adopt change. But it also meant going to the folks in the mobile team who had really grown up at more traditional native software companies like Apple or Mozilla and saying, Facebook does have a different appetite for risk than those companies, and we are willing to make some changes and do things in different ways. And we don't have to go all the way off the deep end and do all the things that we would in the web, but we need to find a middle ground. And what helped was that there was at least a little bit of crossover. There were a few people in both camps that everybody trusted. And furthermore, what helped was there was one, as much as these two groups really kind of thought the other group had bad ethics and bad religion, and it was sort of VI versus Emacs holy war, there was one common set of values that absolutely everybody could agree on, which is we want to do right by the users of Facebook. We want to do right by the people in our community who increasingly want to access Facebook through native apps. And everybody wanted those people to have a great experience. And so that was something that we could all hug on and agree on, and then turn it into a conversation of, okay, we agree on the first principle of what we're here for. Now let's talk about the best way to achieve that. So we made it in the end. It was a rocky ride, and I'm sure there will be still more challenges in Facebook's future. But we were successful, and I think the success came in part from realizing this isn't a technology issue as much as it's a culture and an understanding issue. So I want to give you some so whats. You don't work at Facebook, or I assume most of you don't. And so what can you do with the content in this talk? So I think, if you want to try the exercise, make your own Foursquare, figure out what your priorities are, what's expensive and cheap for you, what parts of your process are well optimized for that and which ones are not. Give it a shot. I think that's, I think the best thing in the world is when you realize that something's quite hard for you and not very important, and you can stop doing it. That's just like, pure win. I think even if you don't do that exercise, or you do it and you don't find it that useful, chances are your process is already relatively optimized, because I think people organically, your DNA shapes what you end up doing and what ends up working for you. So chances are you're already employing something that loosely matches your values or your priorities. But I think another thing is, if you come to a lot of talks like this, or you read widely in Twitter and in blogs, you're going to receive a lot of advice about the best way to make software. And you're going to receive a lot of conflicting advice. And so I think what's helpful is to sort of be able to view that advice through the lens of not, is this advice giver right or is this advice giver wrong? But is this advice coming from somebody who shares my quadrant? Is this advice coming from someone who assumes things are easy for me that are actually hard, or coming from someone who assumes things are important to me that actually are not? So go hunt down advice from people who share your quadrant. I think that's quite useful. I run into a lot of startups that are trying to hire experience. It's very common that I meet, a founding team who are like, we're ready to hire a VP of engineering. And I'm like, why do you want to do that? You can, this is just management. You can figure it out. It's process. It's people management. And you can learn that. And nope, we're just really tired of having to figure everything out from first principles. We want to hire somebody who's seen the movie before and already knows what to do and doesn't have to figure it out. And, and I think that's terrific. I think those people can be a real force multiplier for your company. But if you go hire someone specifically because they've seen the movie before and they know what to do and they don't have to invent a new process, they can just bring a process in that works, make sure that you're hiring someone whose process and whose idea of what works and whose movies they've seen come from loosely the same world as you. It doesn't have to be the same domain, right? It doesn't have to be that, if you're in photo sharing, that they know a lot about photos. But they better have come from a place where their values are shaped by, well, it's really important to be reliable, or, hey, it's not so important to be reliable. You do not have to hire only from your own quadrant. There's brilliant, smart people all over the valley who have experience from all walks of life. There are new college grads who have limited experience of any type. Bring them all in. Just thoughtfully onboard them. It's perfectly fine to hire someone who is used to thinking reliability doesn't matter, as long as you stand them up on day one and say, guess what, at this company, reliability really matters because our users are counting on us. And so I think as long as you do that, and I think it's important to not take those things for granted, to realize that you do need to teach them because they're not universal. And last but not least, I alluded to this earlier, but your quadrant may change. If you're successful, you're going to appear in multiple quadrants. If you're unsuccessful, you're going to pivot, and you may pivot your way right out of your quadrant. And if that happens, realize that your release process needs to change. I think, if I can think of a cautionary tale, I frequently think of Bing. at Microsoft, which is a great search engine. But from a lot of the people I've talked to who worked there, I think that Bing never fully took advantage of the fact that it was in zone 2. It was free, web-based consumer software, and they could have taken so much more risk, and they could have had so much more throughput and engineer productivity than they did. But they could not because, and my theory for why is because at Microsoft, the DNA of what is definitional of a good engineer is one who hits the date. One who is able to estimate his work and then deliver on exactly what he said he would do. What defined whether you got a good performance review and whether you got the bonus or the promotion was schedule predictability, because that was so firmly ingrained from the foundations of who Microsoft is as a company. And for good reasons, right? You want Windows to ship on time when every OEM in the world is standing there unable to make money until you give them Windows 7. But when you apply that to something like Bing, you are not unleashing the full capacity. You are paying a huge tax for schedule predictability that's unneeded. And that was because they couldn't shed that value that you were bad at your job if you didn't hit your deadline. Like, they couldn't even conceive of a world where you didn't have a deadline. And so I think that knowing where your values come from and being able to be on the balls of your feet and have them change, and being sort of skeptical, like understanding that they're grounded in real practical reasons, real structural things, and not tablets from on high, will help you shed them when they're no longer valuable to you, and help you adopt new things when they are valuable to you. So if I had to, sum it all up in a tweet-length phrase, it would be know thyself. And that's and I will stop here and take questions. So if you have anything you'd like to know, I think we have a couple minutes for questions. Maybe did I talk too long? All right. Yes.
I feel like you said Facebook, when you have your mobile team, the product team.
Yeah. 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 So the question is, hey, I'm going through something similar as Facebook, where I have this centralized mobile team and these decentralized product teams. And were there more tactics you used besides getting everybody to kind of hug and agree that we want to do right by users? Yes, there were a number of tactics. So, for one, a big thing we needed to do was build trust between the two teams. I don't know if are you facing that? So one thing we did was we took members of the product teams and we transferred them into the mobile team, and we had them work in kind of an apprentice master model with members, but some of them quickly became the masters. And so once somebody was like on your own team, like they became part of the in-group and were very trusted. And then we also took members of the mobile team and we transferred them out to the product teams. And so now, like, you might say, oh, I don't trust that Pages team. But it's sort of like, well, but I do trust this, I do trust George, who works on the Pages team. And so I'm going to go to George when I'm worried about something they're doing, as opposed to like, sitting at my desk and, being cynical. And so creating that, it's Facebook, right? But I think like all organizations are a social graph, right? And the bonds and the org chart is not the social graph, right? The org chart is one social graph, but there is this other social graph of mutual trust, mutual respect. I've worked with you. I've been in the trenches with you. I can trust the decisions. You caught my mistake. You had my back. And when you can spread the trust graph throughout both those organizations, all the other problems kind of melt away. People work them out for themselves. Actually, training. So speaking of tactics, training was another huge issue. The mobile team was very skeptical that the product teams could deliver high quality code because so many of them were so new to, not just the idioms of Objective-C, which I said were not that hard, and they're not that hard, but the Facebook app code base was very, very complex, and it was really easy to shoot yourself in the foot as a newcomer. So sort of seasoned Facebook product engineers who were new to this code base could and frequently did commit terrible bugs. And part of that was just because the abstractions in the app were so fragile. And so there were a couple things that we did there. One was, we just had to bite the bullet and re-architect and make the app architecture a lot cleaner and a lot harder to screw up in. Which was already the case kind of organically on PHP, because if you on the web, if you mess up your own page, like if the Pages team messes up the Pages UI, like they haven't messed anything up for anybody else. But if you commit, an out of memory error or a crashing bug, in the app, you've crashed the app for everyone. So investing in making the architecture really good and really bulletproof. But the other thing we created, Facebook's famous for having this boot camp program, which is a 6-week kind of introduction tour to the code base, and you sort of work in every part of the code base. We built a second boot camp just for mobile, actually one each for iOS and Android. And we literally put existing seasoned Facebook product engineers through it, where they would spend 6 weeks just being a code monkey for the mobile team, fixing Android bugs and iOS bugs, implementing small features, and doing it under the supervision and code review of the really seasoned, trusted engineers. And so instead of you've learned some Objective-C, you've learned some Android and Java, here you go, turn you loose on the code base, which was sort of what we always did in the web world, was turn, you have the basics of PHP, here you go, you're turned loose on the code base. You spend 6 weeks kind of working carefully under the supervision of someone who knows the code base very well. So after that, you're a little less dangerous. You still don't know everything, but you might recognize some of the dangerous places in the code base when you're in trouble. And you also have some good relationships with people who are now willing to code review for you if you're doing something delicate and dangerous. And so getting the mobile team to trust the product teams was partly about just extending them trust, but partly about the product teams earning the trust by working under supervision for a while, and knowing what they didn't know. Yeah. Yes. Yes.
Since you dealt with a lot of smaller companies, trade-offs.
Yes. 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 Yep.
Or kind of special.
Reliability versus features. And you're in kind of the bottom 3. You're sort of bottom right. You're enterprise software as a service. I mean, what I want to say about this is that when you're tiny, you don't have very many customers yet. And you care more about growth and profit. So you both don't need to monetize your current customers a ton, because much more money is going to come from the future customers. And you also, future customers are going to vastly outnumber the customers that you have today. So I don't want to say reliability doesn't matter. You're only going to get future customers if your current customers reference well. So you don't want to abuse them or treat them horribly, but ideally, in your first, couple dozen customers, if you're at some dollar value, they at some level view themselves as a beta population, or as your friends and family. And the beauty, I said, kind of as an off the cuff remark, that beta programs are excellent for everyone. And they really are, because the beauty of beta is you can kind of let it go on reliability, and not only will the users in that group not be mad at you, the users in the beta program are actually more loyal and like you more than the users who only ever see production quality stuff, because they see the unreliability, but they understand themselves to have signed up for it and to expect it. And moreover, they view themselves as your partner. They view, it's like asking somebody for advice makes you more likable to them, right? They view you as you asking them for help and asking them for feedback and exposing your bugs to you. They feel like they have more influence, and they're assisting you. So if you can get your early customer base to kind of view themselves as beta or pilot or helping you build the company, then you can kind of let reliability, I don't want to say fall by the wayside. You don't want to build a fundamentally unreliable architecture, but the architecture that's reliable, especially in software as a service, the architecture that's reliable for a couple dozen users, will scale to thousands of users, but you're going to have to re-architect for tens of thousands. You're going to have to re-architect again for millions. There's no long-lasting right architecture for scale. The right time to architect for scale is just in front of the scale that you're experiencing. Otherwise, it's premature and it's wasted. So I would say for software as a service in the early days, I would just set early user expectations as beta, and I would not put a lot of effort into reliability, because whatever you do now is going to be wrong anyway. You don't have real load, so you're probably going to guess wrong about what it takes. And so get your feature set right, find your product market fit, and then it's time to think about scale and reliability. So you actually said the last question was the last question. Do I have one more, or can I? I'll stick around. So I'll stay for a few more minutes afterwards, so you can bring your questions to me one-on-one, if that works. Oh, Sophie Charlotte says I can take one more, but I think there were 2 people, so I don't know, you guys Rochambeau it or something. You're side by side. All right, green shirt.
Okay, yeah, my question was making architectural decisions, what we're doing right now is that the main mobile team making all the architecture. A lot of decisions.
Yeah.
How do you work?
I think over the long haul, well, it depends how big you are. So I think centralized mobile teams make sense when you don't have critical mass. Like if you have 20 product teams and 5 mobile engineers, you got to have a centralized team. Because at that point, it's just about a shared service. Like you don't have enough to go around. Like I think the time to fully federate is when you have enough like when every product team has mobile work to do and you have enough mobile engineers to go around. So if you had, 20 product teams, then you probably need, 60 mobile engineers, right? Like you want at least 2 or 3 per group, plus like maybe a 5-man set of senior engineers. I think you do, so Facebook did blow up its mobile infrastructure team. My crowning achievement and declaration of victory was blowing up the mobile team and the product teams fully owning all the functionality, all the features in the app. We did keep a mobile infrastructure team that was working on building abstractions and platforms, but they viewed themselves as a service team, or in an ideal world, I think that such a team should view itself as a service team and that the product teams are their customer. Not themselves as like the only people who know what to do, and the product teams as like these barbarian fools that have to be protected from themselves. So I think like a small set of experts making architecture decisions is generally a good pattern. Okay? So if it's not working well in your environment because the product teams feel like they have no say, or because the architecture isn't working well for what they want to do, then you may have what is a cultural problem or a trust problem. Or you may just have an architecture team who's not in tune with the needs of their customer, right? Like maybe they need to think of themselves as a service team rather than a master team and actually go really listen to the product teams and their needs. So I wouldn't say that, I think there's some virtue in centralizing architecture. I think you can also make it work with decentralized architecture, but some kind of architecture review board. I do think that in native code, unlike on the web, you have one app. You have one payload and delivery vehicle that everybody's in, and one group can screw it up for everybody else. So I do think you need some kind of centralized thinking about architecture and sort of agreement and handshake and making sure that, you don't make some decision about memory management or data storage that actually screws, some set of features over here. But it's got to be done with a lot of respect for the product teams, or ideally involvement. All right, that was really the last question. So I hope it's useful.